Welcome to Chapter 4. We're looking at Key Issue 1. Where are folk and popular leisure activities distributed? From the Rubenstein textbook, I'm Andrew Patterson. So elements of culture. What makes up a society and what do they do that makes them unique? Two aspects: daily necessities of a group of people, how they obtain food, clothing, and shelter, and their leisure activities. When they're not working, what arts are they creating or what are they doing for recreation? As geographers, we examine how culture influences behavior. Put all these together and we see unique locations across the globe. If you're an individual, you might find that you have certain habits or repetitive acts. For example, do you bite your fingernails? Maybe that's a bad habit. Or before every test, maybe you use a certain pen. Maybe that is your habit as an individual. A custom, a repetitive act that a group works on together. This is when a habit becomes a custom for a group of people. So what is the custom of the people in Texas? Maybe we greet each other by saying howdy. I mean, obviously that's not the case anymore, but that could be one of our customs. Within culture, we specifically look at material culture, which is a collection of social customs. So for example, maybe it's customary for youth going to high school to wear jeans in the United States. What is the material culture? And a lot of the ways it helps me remember that, I'm thinking about the tangible objects, the materials that make up their culture. So in this situation, it would be jeans. Folk and pop culture. First thing we look at is the hearth, or the center of an innovation. Where did everything originate from? Within folk culture, sometimes it's hard to know where the origin is, where the hearth is, because it originates at an unknown place, because it goes back way into history. We don't know where lots of folk culture traditions began because we don't know. It wasn't recorded history. But folk culture is small scale. It's transmitted by relocation diffusion slowly over time. It really doesn't diffuse rapidly because it's normally isolated small groups of people. In contrast, popular culture is the product of developed countries, countries that have a lot of influence, that have a lot of materials. Popular culture origins are traceable to a specific person or place because we know that moment in time where their idea exploded and it became popular for everyone. One example was the creation of pop music in the 1900s in the United States, where you had the music industry. It went from people just playing music for small groups and churches and such to it being created for mass populations of people, specifically in Tin Pan Alley in New York City, where producers would create music to sell so that thousands, mass populations of people could hear the music and they could make money off of it. Popular culture. Other things we think of as jeans, iPods, t-shirts, pizza. These are items that have diffused across the world because they're so popular. They're made for the masses. It diffuses rapidly and hierarchically. What we mean is typically it stays within a certain level of people and diffuses across the globe. That's what hierarchically means. Popular culture is distributed widely, and the only limitations are perhaps by a lack of income. Because if Air Jordan shoes are part of pop culture, our limitations are, well, people in developing countries possibly can't afford it. Folk culture. How it remains, why it's so unique, is we look at the isolation of the Himalayan folk culture as an example. This is, we're studying their painting. Each of these cultures creates paintings, but within this 1,500-mile corridor here in Bhutan, Nepal, India, and Tibet. It's interesting because there's so many unique and varied styles that you'll find. For example, Buddhists in the north, they paint idealized divine figures, like this right here. Hindus in the south paint scenes from everyday life, sometimes with a deity. You can see everyday life. There's a guy riding his horse, and there's the elephant right there. Muslims in the West paint flowers and plants, but are prohibited from displaying animate objects in art. So this is why you're seeing some pretty clear images, but there's nothing alive, like there's no people in their art. And the animists They're in the southeast and they paint symbols and designs about their religion. Again, this is folk culture because we have paintings. We have a small, relatively across the earth, a small area right here. But because these people are isolated in the mountains, their paintings developed in a unique way. You should be able to know where you are in this area based on the type of paintings. That's what you can do with folk culture. Folk culture and music. In its earliest origins, some examples we look at here, and it developed in other places across the earth too, but some early examples of folk music origins. China, in 2697 BC, the Emperor Huang Ti sent Ling Lun to cut bamboo poles that sounded like the call of the phoenix. So in China, they try to recreate some sounds and come up with music which they can play over reeds. In Vietnam, another folk tradition is that stories were told through song about planting seeds in winter and summer and what were the best practices for that. So here's two examples of specific locations where folk music came from. And this wasn't created for the masses, it was for individual peoples and tribes and areas that did not spread across the globe. Then, like we were saying earlier, popular music explodes internationally because it's written to be sold and for a large number of people. We talked about Tin Pan Alley in the early 1900s where people were selling the music. From there, popular music expanded, especially from Western or United States, through the Armed Forces Radio Network. So after World War II and during, the Armed Forces have their radio network where they're playing popular songs from the United States. Well, the United States is in so many places across the globe during this time because we're fighting all over the world. And that network diffuses popular music everywhere on Earth. And finally, we find popular music influenced by African folk music, Western dance music, techno, from the United States to Europe, where you can certainly see in the beginning that you get some influence of traditional African music, and it diffuses over to some more isolated places. But once that traditional African folk music gets picked up and combined with aspects, one of them being the techno music, it gets sent globally because it's created for the masses and it spreads very rapidly. Popular sports. Well, they had sports and folk culture, but it didn't really go around the globe. So the one we always think about is soccer, because this is the most popular worldwide sport. In the 11th century, English workers began to kick around a Danish soldier's head, creating the game called Kick the Dane's Head. And there's a couple of ways the stories go, but sometimes it's soldiers that we understood started the game, and sometimes it's workers that were working on this castle area later. But in any case, it's a group of Danish soldiers or Danish people. They began to, it's a group of English workers or soldiers begin to kick around their rivals, the Danes, one of their heads, and it becomes a little game. So instead of some guy's head, eventually they start to use a cow's bladder. And then finally, villages do start to pick up on this trend, but they're spending their time not working. They're playing soccer. So the king bans it all the way up till 1603. Then, over time, it becomes a popular culture sport. What happens is it goes from just being a game that small, isolated villages and groups of people play to a recreational sport where clubs form and people start to get very skilled at the game in the 1800s. Leisure activity comes around. It's created for people working in factories to give them something to do other than go home and drink beer. This became a subject that was taught in schools, so it begins to spread more rapidly. As people had more time, as incomes go up, people began to pay to see professionals who are very skilled at the game. This becomes one of their leisure activities. The British Empire, as it begins to fuse around the world, because they started to have influence where they said at one time the sun never sets on the British Empire because it went all the way around the globe. Everywhere they went, they took the game of football or soccer. And then on top of that, when TV came around, the entire world had access to at least viewing soccer, and it was definitely a popular culture sport. Another sport that's in pop culture is the Olympics. Consider that to be included in the Olympics, a sport must be played in at least 75 countries on 4 continents. That's a whole bunch of people playing your sport. So for example, Taekwondo, pretty much everyone across the globe has that sport in their country. But sports that are not included, that are popular in the United States, would be football or American football And baseball. At one time, baseball was in the Olympics, but they dropped it in the last few years. So in 2016, we expect to see, because this video is coming out before the Olympics, there should be 28 sports in the Olympics. Looking at our World Cup qualifying countries over the years in soccer, who's got the most? Well, you can see where it's diffused. You've got Brazil, Argentina, and then countries in Europe. And of course, USA, we're still developing. We developed later with soccer. It's just now becoming a super popular sport like football and baseball. But then we've got some folk sports that are still surviving. It's not played all over the earth, but they remain. Cricket, which we know is popular in the United Kingdom and the former British colonies, wherever the United Kingdom spread their influence. Wushu, which is a martial arts that combines kicking, jumping, wrestling, and jumping with combat. It hasn't spread across the globe. It still remains a folk sport. Baseball, of course, it's very popular in the United States and even Japan, because after World War II, the United States soldiers introduced the Japanese to baseball, and it became very big there. But other than those two countries, it's not so big across the globe. A lot of the places in Latin America it is, but baseball still remains a folk sport because it's not global. And Australian rules football. It's a very distinctive form of soccer and American football that is limited mostly just to Australia. And you can see, well, you should be able to see, it looks more like a football, but it's kind of yellow, and it's kind of like soccer, but they're carrying it and tackling each other like in football. So those sports survive. That's a look at key issue 1.